Okay, now let's talk about glia or glial cells. These are just the other types of cells in the nervous system. So every cell in the brain and spinal cord is either a neuron or a glial cell. So glial cell is just kind of an umbrella term for anything that's not a neuron. So probably the most numerous and in a way one of the more important types of glial cells are these things called astrocytes. Now, for a long time, no one knew what astrocytes or really any of the non-neuronal cells in the brain did. In fact, the word glia comes from the word for glue, because the assumption was that neurons were really the important cells in the brain. They did all the communication, and the glia were just there to sort of hold the brain together, hold the tissue together like glue. But now we know that glial cells, there are lots of different types, and they have lots of important jobs. And so astrocytes are a good example of this. Astrocytes kind of look like this. They almost look like little neurons in a way. Again, they don't have they're smaller than typical neurons. They don't have axons, but they do have little processes that kind of look like neurites. In fact, that's why they're called astrocytes, because if you stain the brain for a marker for astrocytes, this is what they look like. The processes kind of radiate out from the center, and so they're called that because they look like little stars. So astro again means star in this case. So they're star cells, and their main job is to regulate the extracellular environment around the neuron. So you probably know that the brain, like all tissues, consists of cells, and those cells are kind of bathed in this fluid called the extracellular fluid. And it's mostly water, but there are lots of important molecules in there, and controlling the concentration of those molecules and ions is really important. In fact, we'll talk a lot more later on about the ion concentration inside and outside the cell. So astrocytes, their main job is to control that. So they can adjust or absorb ions from the extracellular fluid if it gets too high, or release them if it gets too low. Also, nutrients and things from the circulatory system are sort of distributed to neurons through astrocytes. So one thing that makes the brain different, the brain and spinal cord different from the rest of the body, is something called the blood-brain barrier. So you probably know how blood works generally. So you have blood vessels that go all throughout the body, delivering oxygen and nutrients to the various tissues. And for the most part, in most of the body, the blood vessels are made of these cells called endothelial cells, and they form a tube, and stuff can get in and out of the blood vessels either by going between those cells or by crossing through the cells. But in the brain, those blood vessel cells are especially tightly packed. So most things cannot get out of the blood. Even though the blood vessels go through the brain, the stuff in the blood itself cannot get into the brain tissue. Some things like oxygen, of course, can just diffuse across small molecules, but larger molecules, and especially things like immune cells, cannot get into the brain. And so astrocytes, part of their job is to help get nutrients and things that are needed in the brain out of the blood and distribute to neurons, and also waste products that are produced by the neurons. The astrocytes help get that out of there. So that's actually what you're seeing here. These are astrocytes. Here's one. Here's another one. And this is a blood vessel. So the blood vessel is running through the brain tissue, and in fact, these little disc-shaped things are red blood cells. But the astrocyte forms this process coming out of these astrocytes, kind of wraps around the blood vessels. And so that's one of their jobs, is to help stuff get in and out of the blood. And this blood-brain barrier is really important because it turns out there's a lot of stuff actually in the blood that is toxic to neurons. And so neurons are especially sensitive to things that would normally be in your blood. And so, in fact, this is why an infection in the brain is such a big problem, because your immune cells also are not allowed to get into the blood or into the brain tissue. So any infection, any virus that makes its way into the brain, your immune system basically can't do anything about it. And in fact, an even bigger problem is when immune cells, for whatever reason, do make their way into the brain tissue because they're not normally there. A lot of proteins and other structures in the brain can be recognized by the immune system as foreign. So what that means is the immune system, your own immune system, can actually attack your nervous system. And this is called an autoimmune reaction. And there are a lot of autoimmune diseases that are caused by either a malfunction in the immune system or a malfunction in the blood-brain barrier. Another thing that happens is if you have a brain or spinal cord injury, of course, what can happen is you can break that blood-brain barrier because blood vessels get broken. And so one of the things that happens in an injury like that is these astrocytes will start to grow and move toward the injury site, and they proliferate around the injury and form what's called a glial scar. So one of their jobs is in an injury is to reform or help reform that blood-brain barrier, which of course is good, like we said, because blood vessel or blood itself, parts of it can be toxic to neurons. So the blood-brain barrier or the glial scar is there to help, again, prevent more injury due to that toxicity. The problem with the glial scar, it turns out, is that it actually prevents axons from growing through it. So this is one of the reasons why brain injury and spinal cord injury especially can be so devastating, is that that glial scar and other factors in damaged tissue prevent damaged axons from regrowing. And so that is the reason why brain injuries and spinal cord injuries tend to be permanent, whereas injuries to the peripheral nervous system, peripheral axons, for reasons that aren't clear, actually do not have that same problem. So peripheral or axons of the peripheral nervous system can usually regrow much more easily than axons in the central nervous system. And so there's actually a lot of research going into studying glial scars and trying to figure out what it is that prevents them from letting regrowing axons go through. And actually there are a lot of sort of promising treatments for those kinds of injuries now that directly target that glial scar. And then you have the various myelinating cells. So myelin is this sort of insulation that wraps around the some axons in both the peripheral and the central nervous system, not all axons. And this is kind of what it looks like. So in fact, if you look at this is an electron microscope image of some neurons or some axons, and the axon again is in the center, and then wrapping around those axons there are many layers of myelin. And so myelin basically is just the cell membrane of these myelinating cells that wraps around the axon many times. And what happens is they wrap around very tightly, and there's very little cytosol. So you can kind of see in this electron microscope image, the layers are very close together. There's very little space for any fluid in there. And the job of myelin is to prevent electrical current from going in or out across that barrier. And that's going to be really important later on when we talk about electrical signals like action potentials. And so the main job of myelin is to basically help speed up the movement of action potentials along the axon by preventing electrical current from leaking out. Now, axons that are myelinated are usually not completely myelinated, so it's only myelinated at it can't be myelinated any closer than the axon hillock or the place where the axon collateral branches off. And then there are usually these gaps in between segments of myelin called nodes of Ranvier. So these nodes of Ranvier are just short little segments where there is no myelin, and there is place for electrical current to go in and out. And those are important too, and we'll talk about them more later. So there are two types of myelinating cells, oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. The main difference between the two is that oligodendrocytes, by definition, are found in the central nervous system, so they're found in the brain and spinal cord. And then Schwann cells are found in the peripheral nervous system, so the axons in your peripheral nerves. The other difference is that one oligodendrocyte can myelinate multiple axons. So it doesn't really look like that here. Here it looks like this one cell is only myelinating this one axon, but a real oligodendrocyte, you would see multiple processes coming off, myelinating multiple axons. Schwann cells, meanwhile, one cell can only myelinate or wrap around one axon. Now that axon can have multiple Schwann cells, but only one Schwann cell per axon. And then other non-neural cells include the ependymal cells. So these are the cells that you will find lining the surface of the brain. We'll talk later about the connective tissue that surrounds the brain later, the meninges, but one of those layers is made up of these ependymal cells, and these are the cells that line the ventricles. So the ventricles we talked about back in the first chapter. These are the empty spaces inside the brain that are normally filled with this clear fluid, and those ependymal cells line those ventricles, and in fact they are the ones that make that fluid. So the fluid inside the ventricles and inside the other cavities inside the brain, and that also kind of surround the brain and spinal cord, is called cerebrospinal fluid, or just CSF. So CSF is this clear fluid that kind of fills these ventricles, kind of provides them with some internal pressure. Also, they're important for moving certain nutrients and molecules around within the brain. Remember that there's a blood-brain barrier that prevents some molecules from getting out of the blood into the brain. So the CSF provides some of the function that blood does in other tissues. Also, the CSF comes out of the ventricles. It's actually made by specialized ependymal cells inside the lateral ventricles called, in this structure called the choroid plexus. This, by the way, is a picture of a rat brain. So what they've done is you're looking at the rat brain from the top, and they've kind of exposed the ventricles, and you can see the choroid plexus inside. There's one set on each side. This is what they look like under the microscope. These are the ependymal cells. They have these little cilia that come out, and so as the CSF is secreted, these little cilia wave back and forth, and they actually move it around. So unlike your blood, which is pumped by your heart, CSF is just moved by these little tiny cilia, which are part of these ependymal cells. So the CSF is produced in the ventricles, and then it flows through this series of canals. So there's a series of ventricles that go down the center of the brain, and then they have little ports that are usually here under the cerebellum, and they enter into the space surrounding the brain and spinal cord, what's called the subarachnoid space. We'll talk about what that means later. But that fluid, again, it kind of helps distribute certain molecules around the brain, but it also acts as a cushion. So you can kind of imagine the brain floating in this big sack of CSF, and it partly is there to help absorb energy. So if you hit your head real hard, some of that energy is absorbed by the fluid rather than the brain itself getting damaged. And then lastly, we have microglia. So these are there to help clean up dead cells and debris. So whenever cells die or part of a cell degenerates, it usually gets broken up into little pieces. And then these microglia come along and sort of eat those pieces and break them down into smaller components. And then those get reused later on. So the microglia, one thing that makes them a little bit different is that they have the ability to kind of move around. So they move around in the brain tissue. And again, wherever they see dead or come across bits of protein or cellular debris, they consume it. These cells are unique to the brain because in the other parts of your body, this function is carried out by cells called phagocytes or white blood cells. But remember that white blood cells and other immune cells cannot come into the brain tissue from the blood. And so these microglia kind of take on the role of phagocytes in the brain. Because again, those immune cells that are found in the rest of the body, if they were found in the brain, can cause an autoimmune reaction. Okay, that is the end of chapter 2. So we will come back to chapter 3 later.